sunny spaces, smiling faces, happy places. But every sunny space holds a shadow. Behind every smile are sharp teeth. And every happy place has something sinister lurking just below the surface.
Welcome to We Saw the Devil, the podcast diving deep into the chilling realms of true crime. Join your host Robin as she unravels mysteries that have left investigators baffled and armchair sleuths obsessed. Be forewarned, dear listener. We Saw the Devil is not for the faint of heart. Our unflinching exploration will take you to the darkest corners of the psyche and through the unimaginable depths of human darkness to unearth stark secrets to the harsh light of day. Nothing will be left untouched. Are you ready? Are you sure? We saw the devil.
Hello, everyone. You are listening to We Saw the Devil. This is Robin, and today's episode is more or less a year in the making. As I said in the last one, it's been about a year since the last Chris Chan episode, and I explained my reasoning why in the previous episode, that I was starting to get burned out. I found the content exploitative, and I just wasn't feeling it. And so I haven't put out episodes in many months. I don't know if the Chris Chan saga was being followed somewhere, but the amount of messages that I have received over the last 6 months asking and pleading for me to finish the Chris Chan saga has been kind of astounding. So today we are going to do just that. And I am so excited. Chris Chan is quite literally the internet's most famous train wreck. There are only maybe three, well, considering he's back online now, maybe 3 to catch up. And the next episode, you guys, early spoiler, the next episode is where it happens. Like, shit hits the fan, mayday, mayday, can't come within so many yards of a school level of activity. So excited to get there, but thank you to everyone who has sent me messages. You know, even in the height of my burnout and busyness and all of it, you know, people were still, please finish Chris Chan. So here we are, you guys. I know based on my last episode from last week that covering Chris Chan is probably a little bit hypocritical, considering the fact that I, am changing the format and everything, but asking you shall receive. I mean, I got 20 episodes deep and there are 3 left. So I figured that all of you amazing people who have stuck around and listened, some of you for years, really appreciate it. And yeah, I want to do something nice. So we're going to talk about Chris Chan today. I guess we can just get the housekeeping out of the way. Again, you're listening to We Saw the Devil if you're new here. You can find the show on Facebook and Twitter at We Saw the Devil, and then also on Instagram at We Saw the Devil Podcast. And if you would like to follow me directly to see, I guess, what concerts I go to and cute pictures of my dogs and parrot, then you can also follow me directly at Robin_WSTD. But before we get into it, so quick thing, completely not show related. My wife got me into Big Brother. And are any of you, I've never watched Big Brother before. I'm not a Survivor, Big Brother, any of those type of shows type of person. She got me into it. And you guys, y'all, I am hooked. I don't really care about the comps, but the social game is so fascinating and watching people make the moves and all of this. And I feel ridiculous because I'm so late in the game. Aren't we on like season 30 or 27 or something like that? So I'm a little behind, but it's crazy. And we're now down to the final 3, Vince, Morgan, and Ashley. Okay. Is anyone else really concerned about Vince? The entire relationship between Morgan and Vince has obviously been one step, depending on the boundaries of his relationship, I guess it would be cheating. But man, it is going to be interesting how this plays out. But I am very concerned that once Vince leaves the house, that he's going to self-harm. Does anyone else feel that way? Is anyone else watching? Because it is a little bit concerning. But we just watched the most recent episode tonight, and and secondly, all I wanted to say is, I don't know if any of you guys have had it, but Arizona now makes a cherry lime Ricky, and it is delicious. I'm currently drinking it now. It's just It's basically a very, very, very tart cherry limeade, and it is delicious, and I highly recommend. All right, so sorry, I needed a little bit of a pre-palate cleanse because we're about to get into it. If you're just now tuning in for the first time or you're not familiar with who Chris Chan is, first of all, consider yourself lucky because once you do, you can't unknow it, right? It will be internet lore that you'll be holding on to for the rest of your lives. And for nearly 2 decades now, he has been the internet's most famous train wreck. Part lolcow, part cautionary tale, part nightmare. Go back and if you find interest in, I would say, the next minute and a half, go back to square one, stop the episode, and go back to episode 1 and just listen to the story from the beginning. But Chris Chan was just some kid from Virginia, and he's on the autism spectrum. He just has gone online and documented his life and done really heinous things. You may be asking yourself, Robin, why are you covering this on a true crime podcast? Well, that is because he commits an incredibly disturbing and heinous crime, which we are about to cover in the next episode. I'm just going to go ahead and give some highlights to describe who Chris Chan is. Again, just very much on the autism spectrum, multiple comorbidities, great deal of actual mental illness, and the amalgamation of that and having unfettered access to the internet. But we're going to cover, like I said, the greatest hits and just some highlights so you kind of get the gist here. So, violence and threats. Chris has a very long history. Don't know what that was. Chris has a long history of violence and threats. In 2014, he ended up macing a GameStop employee simply because they refused to change the color of Sonic the Hedgehog's arms on a poster. In 2016, he escalated further, posting repeated death threats towards Donald Trump, catching the attention of the FBI. So we already have that, on top of yelling and screaming and threatening children at local neighborhood gaming shops if they won. Like, there are pictures of him cursing out a maybe 6-year-old young black child because the kid beat him. At that point, he was probably 25, 26 at a game. Equally disturbing is Chris's lifelong obsession with women. He spent years on what he called his love quest, a mission to find a boyfriend-free girl. He harassed and pressured women in his hometown, leaving creepy flyers begging for a girlfriend. He stalked women, scared them off, and he even tries to, later on, guilt-trip lesbians into dating him, insisting he counted as a woman. What he framed as desperation was, in reality, incredibly predatory. The lore of Chris Chan is called Christery. It seriously, there's so much of it, it has its own name. If you look up the quickie, so Chris became famous because he created his own comic character, Sonichu, which looks 99.8% like Sonic the Hedgehog, but yellow, little bit different coloring. He invented his own universe, and with that, he basically turned his hometown into this magical world, fantastical world, similar to, one, say, Sonic the Hedgehog would live in, and created all these characters in this entire world. CWCKI. And what that is, it's a website devoted to following him and his every move. It goes into every saga, every story, every person he's ever mentioned, every YouTube video, PlayStation video, anything that Chris has done is documented on this site. And that is why Chris Chan is considered the most documented human being in all of history. Because you'll see, just go there, take a minute, search around. They actually even have the chronology of Chris Chan's life down by year, which then you can go into by month and then go into by day. That's how much Chris Chan was on the internet. So we're talking over 2 decades of Chris Chan being online almost every single day, except for a certain stint he did. But Chris did end up transitioning and claiming to be trans. We're all allies here. I have no idea. but people are up in arms when you're talking about Chris Chan of, do you call Chris Chan Chris and he, him, or do you say she, her, and use the chosen name Christine? Well, what Chris Chan wants to go by now is actually Mrs. Jesus Christine W. Chandler, Sonichu Prime, Goddess Blueheart, Commodore Consoles, the One Avatar, and the creator of Sonichu and Rosechu. If you go to Chris Chan's Twitter account, I refuse to call it X, you will see that they currently have 113,000 followers, and that is their bio. And this is something that I periodically got hate for with previous Chris Chan episodes is, do I misgender them? For these episodes, I'm going to refer to Chris Chan as Chris Chan, he, him. And that is due to the fact that Chris Chan has stated and shown through behavior as well that they are pretending to be a lesbian in order to get women, and that they feel that women will feel safer and like them more if they are a woman. Add on to that the extreme levels of mental illness and the predatory behavior from Chris towards women. And then obviously also everyone knowing them as Chris Chan. So for the sake of storytelling and explaining everything, we are going to call Chris, he, him. Piggybacking off of the sexual and gross behaviors, Chris's sexual history is as grotesque as it is tragic. He uploaded a video of himself having sex with a blow-up doll. He did this multiple times. He filmed a, quote, breast massage routine that no one ever asked for. When Chris decided to transition, he started massaging his breasts and tweaking his nipples, recording it, and then telling everyone about it. He also admitted to and bragged about drinking his own semen. He called it holy fluid. And also, in perhaps one of the most infamous moments in Christery, he sliced open his own taint and convinced himself that it was the beginning of a vagina forming. He believed it thanks to subliminal hypnosis videos that he found on YouTube. So again, we are dealing with a very, very, very high level of mental illness here. Again, autism spectrum, mental illness, unfettered access to the internet, and horrible, horrible parents. So it does feel exploitative to cover this, but again, I promise these episodes for you, so here I am. And these little bullet points are also kind of like mini synopses of previous episodes and content that I've covered already. So if any of this is hitting you like a ton of bricks of what the fuck, please, again, go back and listen to the earlier episodes. Because then there's Barb, Chris's elderly mother, who he exploited endlessly. Barb was pretty freaking terrible herself, but Chris dragged her into his videos. He forced her to beg for money. He blamed her for any and all financial mismanagement, all while racking up debts in her name. Debts that led to lawsuits, multiple lawsuits and court appearances by Barb. Chris used her as both a shield and a crutch at an enormous, enormous cost to her well-being, which we will be discussing in next week's episode. Now, in terms of the financial mismanagement, to fund his lifestyle, Chris turned to manipulation and scams. See, Chris lived at home with his mom, Barb. His father died, and it was just him and his elderly mother, Barb. And they were not well-off people. They weren't destitute, but they were constantly in jeopardy of losing their house. Barb didn't work anymore, and Chris also brought in a very, very small amount of Social Security. He begged for money constantly. He claimed that it was for Barb's medication or to save their house or for Sonichu projects. Yet the cash went straight to toys, video games, and shit that, fans paid him for custom artwork and merchandise. And 90% of the time, it was actually never even sent to them. People would pay, 30, 40, 50, upwards of $100 for custom artwork from Chris. And 90% of the time, they never got it. Chris's e-begging wasn't even just persistent. It was pathological. So in short, who is Chris Chan? Chris Chan is not even just an internet punchline. He is a decades-long case study in obsession, delusion, and exploitation. Violence, harassment, disturbing sexual behavior, financial manipulation. Chris has checked every single box at some point, most of them numerous times. And if you're new to this saga, buckle up, because this isn't just the story of an eccentric cartoonist. It is the story of the most infamous lolcow in internet history and the most documented man on Earth. And as we're getting into it, if you recall, I am doing a month-to-month breakdown. So much happens that I have to actually tell you about that I am breaking this down month by month, year by year. So in this episode, we're covering January of 2020 to June of 2021, right before the incident. January of 2020. Chris was 37 years old, and it was pretty quiet. At least in terms of visibility. There were no new videos, no fresh selfies, no big meltdowns on camera, but it was kind of eventful. So on New Year's Day, Chris apparently celebrated the 20s with one of his trademark bizarre songs. Chris was notorious for writing songs. He did a sync over, God, I don't listen to boy bands, you guys, so I'm sorry, but the I Want It That Way, is that the Backstreet Boys or NSYNC? Please forgive me. Don't tar and feather me. But he made one called I Want a Girlfriend over that, and it's just horrible and heinous. But he made a really weird New Year song. A few days later, he was gifted a crystal-infused water bottle because in Chris's mind, magic rocks fix everything. No offense to the New Age girlies out there who feel the same way, but Chris really started going kind of overboard. Well, I wouldn't say overboard, but he really started getting involved in talking about metaphysical things at this time. By January 11th, he was role-playing as his alter ego, Scarlet Selenia, one of his self-insert here fantasy characters. And this is something that I talked about in the previous episode, that was like 5-7 years ago, it feels like, is that Chris still slowly started losing his mind. Chris has always been under attack by various trolls, whether they were one-off trolls, individual trolls that wanted attention or to troll him, or actual groups of people that even name themselves. So there was a group called the Idea Guys, and these people largely prey upon and manipulate Chris. And that's what I think I find so fascinating about Chris Chan as a person. Yes, he's done so many horrible, heinous, disgusting things, but he's also so gullible and easily manipulated himself. It almost sometimes makes you feel bad for him, but that does not last for more than maybe a millisecond. But the Idea Guys really double down on making him lose his mind in terms of believing that reality was merging with this fantastical Quickville, Sonichu new realm, and he started creating more or less his own, well, eventually religion. But at this point, he's talking about the dimensional merge and everything. Basically, the real world is going to merge with his comic characters. And so he starts sexualizing his comic characters like he's married to them and having them as children, like they're his children. It's really, really mentally ill and weird. It's really, 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 really out there. He was starting to self-insert his own fantasy characters. It was also around this time that he was considering dropping over $100 for a meet and greet with My Little Pony celebrities at BabsCon, which is a My Little Pony convention. Chris was a brony. And if you're also not familiar with bronies, they are grown adults who love My Little Pony. The newer ones, right? The show Friendship is Magic, I think, is the big one there. And there are cons for bronies. Grown men congregate and they share their love of My Little Ponies. Chris went to a bunch of these cons, a couple he was banned from and kicked out of. He also goes to a lot of anime conventions. At this time, he was making videos begging and pleading for money. We're about to lose my house. Barb needs dentist. And then he was about to drop $105 for a meet and greet at a My Little Pony convention and begging for money to attend. But Chris's biggest fixation that month was his banning from the End Games, his local game shop. On January 17th, he whined on Twitter that he needed to be unbanned so he could learn Dungeons and Dragons. Because according to him, it was vital to completing the so-called dimensional merge. But the End Games wasn't having it. By the 23rd, they reaffirmed his ban by outright blocking him on Twitter. Naturally, Chris lashed out, accusing them of being non-inclusive and smearing his reputation. He claimed that it was because he was trans and the decision was based on homophobia. Never mind the fact that Chris sexually harasses almost every single woman that he met. Never mind the fact that he was creepy, that he was angry, that he lashed out, that he was obsessive, that he stalked women, that he was angry and malicious to children. And it also could have been the fact that Chris was very open to admitting that he consistently soiled himself, that he would shit his pants, he would shadoodle his drawers, and he would walk around with poop in his pants. He also admitted previously as well that he would poop his pants so much and then he would just take his pants down and throw them on the ground. He wouldn't go launder them. He wouldn't take care of them. He would literally shadoodle his pants and then just drop them on the floor in the middle of the hallway or the bathroom and just be like, oh, well, and wouldn't even shower. Just put on a new pair of pants and underwear and go on his merry day. So you can imagine that between the smell and the predatory behavior, that the end games did not want him as a patron. Also in January, it brought us the 11th anniversary of the Quickie. Again, the Quickie is your place, one-stop shop for all things Chris Chan. This is also the time that Encyclopedia Dramatica went down after their sysop got arrested. If you guys recall, Encyclopedia Dramatica was very, very similar to Kiwi Farms in the sense that they would talk about, people who got made fun of on the internet and things like that. But it went down. It was another big site that covered Chris and all of his shenanigans. Also, 2 creditors filed fresh lawsuits against Chris. So this actually put his total debt cases, these are cases that he ended up being sued by the creditors, up to 11. If you recall his mother in previous episodes, his mother Barb had already been sued by a creditor. So at this point in 2020, the Chandler household was absolutely drowning in debt. And Chris was begging, and it was not looking good. But magically, Chris would spend the Social Security money that he had and access to Barb's money and buy toys and stuff like that and go to conventions. It made absolutely no financial sense whatsoever. And that financial mismanagement would very quickly continue into February. February kicked off immediately with Chris begging online for someone to buy him a Nintendo Switch copy of Pokemon Shield for his birthday. Then, in the middle of the month, he live-streamed himself reading SNT vs. Sonichu, which was a fan fiction that mashed him up with Project SNT, another brony YouTuber. And in true Chris fashion, he declared everything written in the story was real, acknowledging it as canon to his already insane dimensional lore. And what that means is, I'm sure that's kind of confusing, is that he was starting to craft at that point. Previously, kind of the psychosis kind of started around the idea guys, I would say, that, again, the dimensional merge of everything merging between his comic plane and reality. And he started creating storylines and giving backstories and creating lore and all of this. He was literally writing his own fantasy RPG in real time. On February 14th, the Sonic the Hedgehog movie dropped in US theaters, and Chris went to see it. And despite Sonic having the dreaded blue arms that seriously got him maced in a GameStop, he said that he loved it and even recommended it on Twitter. During this time, previously he'd used Facebook and he'd started to use Twitter, but he's exceptionally active on Twitter at this time. And leave it to him to get grotesque and sexual on social media. On the 22nd of February, he replied to a post about someone overhearing their parents having sex. And somehow, he actually escalated it by sharing a traumatic childhood memory of seeing his father's penis when he was a child. Naturally, trolls jumped on this. And by the 23rd, Chris had posted a long screed claiming that trolls had given him PTSD, made him hate sex, and that they'd all go down in some future cosmic punishment. By the 24th, it was his birthday, Christian Love Day, and he turned 38 years old. In March of 2020, if you guys recall, COVID was heating up. And also, simultaneously, conventions were turning on him. Chris had become notorious at this point. Convention workers, people who were into the brony community, My Little Pony, anime, Sonic the Hedgehog, things like that, everyone knew who Chris Chan was. He was infamous, you guys, at this point. So, and again, part of him being the most documented person on Earth, anywhere he goes, he's so infamous for the insane crap that he's done that everyone takes pictures of him everywhere he goes. Even now, in 2025, he checks his mail and someone's there taking a picture and posting it online. And then the quickie updates, the latest update that same day. I mean, it's wild, you guys. But anyway, this is the time when COVID was really, really hitting in 2020 initially, the first round. Sequestria Fest, which was a large My Little Pony convention, officially had him on their banned list. Like, he was not able to go to conventions because previously he's had meltdowns. Police have had to be called on him. No one wants him. And then March 13th marked the national emergency declaration for COVID-19. March was special for Chris because it was the 20th anniversary of Sonichu's creation. But he could not celebrate that because all of the My Little Pony conventions were canceled. And when they were canceled, he pivoted into a charity sale to, quote, help artists and vendors affected by the BronyCon cancellations. Now, again, this is someone who manipulates and would sell art and not send things and stuff like that. So the fact that he pivoted to a charity sale running a charity, I'm going to just leave that one there for the universe. March saw him peddling the Righteous Rising Twilight Sparkle Secret Shipfic Folder expansion pack on Quickville Shopping. He was posting about using amethyst crystals in his water bottle to, quote, protect against coronavirus. And he was also, you'll be very happy for him, he was celebrating the second anniversary of his polyamorous marriage with the fictional comic characters that he had created. And people at this point were really starting to call him out on the incestuous nature of some of the comic book characters in there. So Chris Chan, previously he was his own character. He was Chris. And then there was Sonichu, who was a separate character. There's Rose Chu, and he created dozens, if not hundreds, of characters. But a lot of them involved characters kissing or touching or talking sexually to one another. And people started calling him out for being incestuous. And then at the end of the month, he challenged his orbiters to dig up positive shipping fan fiction about him. And if you're unsure of what shipping fan fiction means, it's basically when people, say, watch a show or read a book or something like that. They did it for Twilight, True Blood. People write fiction stories about two characters and put them together. So he asked his followers to search the internet for good fan fiction about him. But it had to be written before his poly marriage date, because even in a pandemic, Chris had to make it all about himself. April of 2020 arrived with a pandemic in full swing. And while the world was struggling to adapt with it, Chris spiraled into one of his strangest delusions yet. Mid-month, on April 15th, he announced that he had body swapped with Sonichu. Yes, Chris claimed that the cartoon Electric Hedgehog was now piloting his body, while he was off in Quickville, the imaginary world that he had created. And this wasn't just a one-off joke. This maladaptive coping mechanism that he created would last until February of the following year. So he was in full dimensional merge. I have been body swapped with a cartoon character. At the end of the month, he was interviewed live by Leftover Media. But then the next day, he made posts about his birthday, which of course were tied into his ever-changing lore and the Idea Guy retcons. Now, for those unaware, again, of what the Idea Guys were, I know it's been a while. I know I just briefly mentioned them, but they were a small group of trolls led by Joshua Allen Wise, aka Idea Guy, often role-playing as a user by the name of John Yamada. Also, another Idea Guy was Stephen Boyd, and Stephen Boyd manipulated Chris from October of 2017 to April of 2018 by LARPing as characters in his fantasy world. They would contact Chris or talk to Chris and LARP, live action roleplay, and pretend that they were characters in Quickville, in Chris's fantasy world. And Chris, because he's so gone, believed it and went along with it, one or the other. And they used that access to gaslight and extort Chris out of about $6,000 in gift cards and goods. They threatened to destroy his imaginary city of Quickville and also really pushed some of the major lore changes, like the dimensional merge. Chris said that he was in a poly marriage with his cartoon characters. A few other unnamed members joined a few times across different time periods, but eventually their influence, the Idea Guys' influence, was cut off by counter groups. There were other groups. So many people trolled Chris, you guys. I'm talking probably thousands over the course of 20 years. But there were some people who saw him as a sad, mentally ill, exploited person and tried to kind of protect or shield him from that and help him. But Chris always ended up dicking them over, screwing them over. He would happily accept money and then be, ask, why isn't there more? Or why aren't you, it never went well. Or there were other troll groups that wanted full control over Chris, so they would try to, they were basically having gang turf wars over Chris Chan. I mean, that is the power that Chris was wielding at that point. May brought more financial dysfunction. I mean, it was quieter, but not without a couple classic Chris moments. So on May 2nd, now mind you, again, this is after he has up to 11 court cases. His mother's been sued. They are broke. On May 2nd, he pre-ordered a bracelet charm from a Twitter artist, proving that he still spent money that he didn't really have. And I'm going to go ahead and assume that that bracelet was for himself and not for his mother, because Mother's Day was on the 10th, and he just tweeted out well wishes, which is something that a wholesome moment is hard to come by in this story, you guys. If you're looking for a Hallmark topic or something that's feel good, the Chris Chan story ain't it. But he did tweet well wishes to people on Mother's Day, which did show at least one moment of something sentimental. Chris was scheduled to have a debt hearing on May 20th, but because of COVID, it was pushed back to September. So Chris had a couple months before he had to go to court with his creditor. By the 25th, though, he was back to begging on Twitter, trying to get people to buy his Sonichu cards. Begging for money, and 4 days later, he revealed what he'd done with his COVID stimulus check. He bought an iPad. June took a darker turn. On June 1st, a man named James Lewis Martin committed suicide, and this event became a really strange footnote in the orbit of Chris's online world. James Lewis Martin, also known as William Robinson, or something that Chris Chan would go by later on, was CPU Goddess Blueheart, was Chris's name. CPU, literally the computer term. So James Lewis Martin was kind of a supporter of Chris. He was also autistic, and he was super into the Sonichu world that Chris had created. He gave Chris a good amount of money, as well as affirmation, over Quickville and Sonichu and so on and so forth. He pretended to also be a CPU god. So really, he was kind of enabling and supporting and propping up Chris's delusions. Now, James would actually send his aunt, a social worker, to Chris's house directly to do a welfare check. Chris didn't even open the door because he thought there was a social worker there to commit him to a mental hospital. But James Martin sent Chris money and tried to support him. He would say that he didn't want Chris to go homeless or his mother to go homeless, and he wanted to try to help fund his other expenses. Because James Martin was incredibly mentally ill and had been looking at disturbing things online, from what has been reported, his parents discovered him online because that was against family restrictions in his home. He also went on Kiwi Farms, which, if you recall, that was the really fucked up trolling and doxing website. Also, a lot of Chris Chan on there as well. He went on Kiwi Farms and tried to defend Chris and, white knight for Chris. And he, in turn, again, Chris Chan being the most documented human being alive, everyone saw James Martin communicating with Chris, talking to Chris, so they decided to harass him as well. The depression he went through due to that, he actually ended up committing suicide on June 1st. And that is directly tied into Chris Chan. July of 2020 was peak batshittery. And we're going to go through the days. On July 1st, while role-playing as Sonichu, because again, remember, Sonichu had taken over Chris's body, Chris finally pushed back at the old troll Jacob Sockness, if you recall, telling him to basically back the fuck off after years of enabling and really creepy, weird rituals. Around the same time, the official Quickie Discord server was created, and a lot of people hopped on Discord to talk about Chris Chan. On the 2nd, literally the next day, Chris hand wrote something he called the Whispering Spell. And that was, again, part of his ever now growing magical roleplay. By the 8th, Chris was doxing dozens of supposed trolls on Twitter, urging his, quote, personal army to attack them. On the 14th, he wrote out yet another spell, the Dimensional Barrier Shatter spell. As you can see, he is committing hard to this delusion that there is going to be a dimensional merge. Literally the next day, on the 15th, he crossed another line by tweeting a sexually suggestive remark to a female artist that he had been orbiting. She immediately blocked him. Because again, Chris is very hypersexual, and that's where it goes with almost every single woman he meets. The next day, Chris logged into Kiwi Farms to speak with Null directly, who is basically over pretty much everything and knew Chris and had previously really actually genuinely tried to help Chris. Chris and Barb's house burned down. Null helped get money together and sent him several thousand. But during that conversation with Null, Chris rambled endlessly about being possessed by Sonichu, the fantasy lore that he was creating, Jacob Sockness, and something that he called the Iron Curtain. Null ended up cutting him off, saying that he wouldn't play along with the game, that he was delusional and that he wasn't going to play along with it, and cut Chris off completely. And again, we've talked about a lot of internet trolls, dozens of them, during the 20 episodes of this series. Well, Jacob Sockness was infamous for doing rituals. So he would do rituals like he would buy cards from Chris, right? And then he would do a blood ritual, declaring himself blood brothers with Chris's imaginary husband. And Chris believed this, but he dismissed this instance as failure and said that it didn't work. His spell didn't work. But Chris is living, again, in this fantasy world. And to close the month, July 30th brought around the beginning of the Not DMs, another set of conversations that would end up fueling the infamous 2020 Discord leaks, which we will be covering. Now, also to note is during this time, Chris has been communicating with someone named Kai. Kai was one of the players in a Dungeons & Dragons group that Chris joined earlier in 2020. And this person went along with everything that Chris was saying. And Chris really attached to Kai and they had really weird interactions. So I'm going to read an interaction. These are messages leaked and part of the infamous Discord leaks. But these are notorious in Christery because they really show how far gone Chris was getting. Kai says, "Stay safe, my galaxy," with a star emoji. Chris, as Sonichu, mind you, again, he's being controlled. Chris says, "I've been seeing many portals and dimensional breaks in and out of dreams lately as well. Sure, I'll call you around then. For me, please, see if you can speak up and enunciate during the call. Thank you." Kai, "Will do. Christine, this Kai, I've noticed an interdimensional break." But these trolls were truly enabling Chris, and these infamous Discord leaks, which you can find them all online as well, really just show that Chris is slipping from reality and really embracing this as, this is it. Their exchanges show just how deeply Chris was embedding his fantasy roleplay into his real-world interactions. It was becoming so that most of Chris's interactions were him pretending to be Sonichu and his enablers feeding into it. And this shows how blurred the line between fantasy and reality had become for him. So TLDR, between April and July 2020, Chris went full tilt into escapism. COVID gave him the perfect excuse to declare he'd literally swapped bodies with Sonichu. He was writing spells and rituals. He was becoming obsessed with crystals. He was tangling and getting into fights with trolls, trying to dox them. And he was diving deep into his enabler relationships with Kai and a couple other trolls and people. And all of this was just setting the stage for even bigger meltdowns to come later in the year. August of 2020 was no different. The pandemic, if you recall, was still raging, and Chris was starting to get on Discord, and another group of trolls that had been staking him out, called the Watchmen, were just leaking content left and right on him. But remember Kai, the person I told you about momentarily, from the Dungeons & Dragons person that was really, engaging with Chris and sending him down the rabbit hole? On August 2nd, Chris wrote and recorded his last will and testament, his own. And in this last will and testament, he announced that when he left for Dimension C197, yes, that's the name of the new dimension once the merge happens, he was dead serious about this, that all of his possessions were to go to Megan Ringo and Kevin Fairchild, also known as Kai. He even said that Barb, his mother, had to allow Kevin to move into the Chandler residence. Then on August 10th, one of the Watchmen, leaked a mountain of Chris content, from chats to pictures of his room. Chris himself even joined the Quickie Discord server at Nott's request, only to immediately stumble into a leaked letter he'd written to Kai earlier in the year. Naturally, he was furious. By the 11th, the full version of Tour of Chris's House 3 was leaked. And people get this, like trolls would reach out to him, befriend him, manipulate him, and convince him to take videos, or they would pretend to be a young hot girl or whatever and get Chris to do things. Well, Tour of Chris's House 3 was leaked, and just a few days later, Chris was banned from the official Quickie Discord server, which sent him off the ledge. On the 16th, he popped onto Twitter showing off an air conditioner, a brand new air conditioner, as well as himself in a do-rag. On the 22nd, he was back on Discord and he was holding Q&A sessions for people, which obviously they ended up just basically being transcribed, saved, and put onto the Quickie. But other random happenings from the month of August include his application to be an official Pokemon Go Pokestop. That was rejected by Pokemon, the makers of Pokemon, and he was pissed. He also role-played as being from an alternate dimension to dodge questions in Discord and email chats. He also complained heavily about a YouTuber named Dylan Thomas, and then after doing so and complaining as Chris Chan, he went back to being possessed and, being Sonichu. Also, to cap it all off, on the 31st, the last day of the month, Kiwi Farms posted court files from Chris's 2018 trespassing charge. If you recall, he got popped trespassing. And this is the one where Chris had signed his name in legal documents as Chris Chan Sonichu. Now off to September. September kept the drama rolling. On September 2nd, 2 of Chris's long-running debt cases finally closed. He owed just under $3,700 total. He downplayed it in chats with the Watchmen and with other trolls, but he distracted himself buying new and playing with Transformers toys. And of course, he tied his need for purchasing these things, even though he's drowning in debt, back to the dimensional merge. And by September, Barb, his mother, hadn't really been making appearances in any videos for begging in a while. And so people were like, yo, Chris, where's your mom? Where's Barb? And so Chris more or less forced her to record a short video insisting that she was fine and all is well. Basically, proof of life footage. Also that same day, he was publicly venting about his mom's dogs, Clover and Snoopy, and how they made it impossible for him to host visitors or have, romantic partners or girlfriends over. And if you recall in a previous episode, something really sad about this is that the Chandler, Chris and Barb and Bob back in the day, Chris's dad, they had pets. They had cats. They had, got dogs. And they were horribly obese, like fat, obese beagles. And they never took them out. They apparently let them shit all over the house. They never cleaned it. People have described it as just the most wretched, rotten smell. If you also recall in previous episodes, there was a period when I also mentioned it earlier, their house caught on fire, and I believe one of their cats perished in the fire. All of that to say, their house was disgusting, and it's very, very sad that their animals were treated as horribly as they were. And Chris was publicly bitching about it because Barb was not a great person herself. She was pretty awful and abusive and incredibly manipulative as well. And then September 6th marked 9 years since Bob's death. Chris, and this was very, very, very telling, this was an omen. Chris publicly and weirdly compared himself and Barb to anime characters. And the anime characters that he compared them to actually shared romantic kissing scenes. Chris, when his father passed, became the quote-unquote man of the house, and Barb, his mother, would demand that Chris sleep in bed with her. Now, this is when he was like a 30-year-old man, 29, 30. And his mother would demand that Chris sleep in bed with her, and she would cuddle him. And people had mentioned how incestuously weird it was. And this was yet just another instance of Chris being incestuous and weird, but we would start to see more of that coming with Barb. And speaking of characters, it was also at this point that Chris was starting to really be vocal about his loneliness, his feelings of loneliness, because Rose Chew, the female version of Sonichu, whatever, is there? I'm not into Sonic the Hedgehog. I know nothing. Is there a female version of Sonic, like a fast hedgehog? I don't know, but it would basically be the equivalent. And if there is an equivalent, he stole it directly. But he was starting to complain that Rose Chew, the female character, was, quote, stuck behind the Iron Curtain. So he was actively depressed over the fact that these fictional characters were fictional. On the 20th, he returned to the Charlottesville Fashion Square Mall, which, if you guys remember, he was trespassed from the property years earlier. He was not allowed on the property, but he did end up going there, and he had lunch with Prater members to discuss business. Prater is a group, we'll talk more about them later, but it was a group of people who they helped Chris, but they, in business propositions, tried to help him. I believe he is still working with Prater. I'm not sure. But it's also to try to manipulate as well, but they don't quite actively troll him, if that makes sense. By the 26th, Chris was fighting with some random customer named Justin over undelivered comics. Justin had ordered comics from Chris, and instead of sending the comics, he took his money, did not send the comics, and then doxed Justin. Like, Chris doxed his customer in a Discord server, and then told all of his users and followers and everyone in the Discord server to dig into his background and get him fired. That brings us to October. October was jam-packed with Chris at his most unhinged and delusional. On October 1st, Barb turned 79 years old. The next day, Chris released another Brony reaction video, where he watches My Little Pony content and then reacts to it. And he insisted that he hadn't cursed Donald Trump with COVID. At this point, he was claiming that he could cast spells and curse people. Also, an enabler, we're going to start calling trolls versus enablers, which I know they're very, 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 very close. But an enabler of his pitched the idea of Chris writing the Chris Chan Bible. And Chris was actually really considering this, which is something that I think this was a seed that was planted. During this time, he continued pumping out merge lore. He was analyzing dreams, posting about spells, claiming that the Iron Curtain between dimensions would shatter between October 22nd and 23rd. Sure enough, on October 21st, he told his Discord, it is happening now. Yeah, no further explanation there. Just, it's happening now. His Sonichu medallion broke again. And his Sonichu medallion is he made himself a medallion of the face, like head of Sonichu. It's yellow. He made it with putty, and it dirty. It looks dirty and rotten like a decaying corpse, but it broke. And he took that as some kind of sign. So he decided to celebrate the merge coming by going to Burger King, because Bob, his dad, loved Burger King, and he was going to prep for the merge event. His Burger King meal was, in fact, that celebration. And then the next day, on the 23rd, he claimed success. We did it. And just to go over a couple things for the rest of the month, it included more chats with Prater, the group of the enablers. He bought a very expensive Rainbow Dash My Little Pony figure, which, he was swimming in money, right? He was recording many more Merge video scripts, and he was also actually interviewed on the Create Unknown podcast. Now, obviously, on the 31st, that's Halloween, but Chris, who typically celebrated Halloween, pretty much ignored it because he believed that the merge had begun. On November 2nd of 2020, Chris bought an Xbox trophy figurine at Target and used it as an excuse to reminisce about his high school graduation, which was not good. The next day, the presidential election took place. Chris claimed that he had cast his ballot for Simpsons character Lisa Simpson. When Biden was actually declared the winner on the 7th, Chris was already deep in his fantasy world, daydreaming about Sonic. He continued his Q&A sessions online, he released videos, and he even took a sudden interest in Randy Stair, a mass shooter from 2017. On the 6th, he recorded an audio file meant to, quote, help Randy send a post-death message. Disturbing doesn't even begin to cover that. Mid-month, Chris complained about sleep deprivation and body shakes, which he blamed on the merge. He recorded demo voice tracks for a Sonichu mod, critiqued some fan fiction, and talked about doppelgangers of himself dying in alternate dimensions. So by the close of November, Chris had spiraled deeper into magical thinking. Doppelgangers, prophecies, mass shooters, merge visions, while the rest of the world was trying to navigate lockdowns and a presidential election. August through November of 2020, that really encapsulated Chris at his worst. Tangled up in online leaks, drowning in debt, treating fantasy like reality, and endlessly embarrassing himself online. But, he's obviously done way more heinous shit in the past, right? But if you think that this is peak Chris in terms of losing his mind, just wait. Because December of 2020 and the lead up to 2021 would push everything in what we've been talking about even further. I'm not going to get into it, but Chris also started battling a couple of his enablers. People who, like, Chris would come out with something, right? And then people would create their own little comics combating, say, attacking Quickville or marrying one of Chris's favorite characters. Stupid things like that, right? But Chris went all in on it. And these people were laughing at his expense, obviously, and trolling a 37-year-old autistic man. But Chris went all in on it. And so he started fighting with multiple trolls/enablers online who were further pushing him into a mental breakdown, basically. And simultaneously, he also begins and pivots to hawking, quote, personally approved Praetor medallions. Now, again, I mentioned Praetor, the group that, kind of works with Chris and still works with him. They were enablers. No one's quite sure of their intentions, but they are helping Chris get money. They currently, if you look up Chris Chan on Etsy, Chris Chan has a store on Etsy. You can look at it. And they sell medallions, so you too can get your own Sonichu medallion. And trolls and people who found Chris Chan hilarious would buy this shit. And so Praetor really was the first kind of instance of Chris getting into, an official business arrangement with someone selling merchandise. On December 12th, he roleplayed that Rose Chu had joined Sonichu in possessing his body. So here we have mid-December, Chris saying that he is possessed by both a male and female character. And on a more somber note, Christmas Day, so December of 2020, marked the last time that Chris would spend a holiday in the Chandler home. January of 2021 started quiet, but did not end that way. On New Year's Day, Chris proclaimed that the dimensional merge had hit an apex. During this time, he's also being creepy with the supposed women in the group. So one girl showed him a Transformers Funko Pop, and they were talking and discussing it, and Chris was like, I'm going to buy it for you. I need your address to send it. And that is a classic Chris Chan, classic boundary testing move. He would frequently do that to any woman that came across him. He would immediately ask, I want to send you a gift. Give me your address. And he would do it under a friendly pretense. But if you know anything about Chris Chan, you know that there is no such thing. At least there was no such thing as a friendly pretense. Also during this time, Chris was fighting with a lot of different mods and a lot of different users. after a lot of manipulation, Chris ended up lashing out. And he started attacking users on Twitter. So he started going after these random Twitter users that he was accusing of harassing him and whatnot. And he was sending them these weird sexual religious DMs, including, for all my true crime people out there, an Albert Fish quote about a scat fetish. He was attacking random Twitter people, Twitter users, sending them DMs being weirdly sexual and religious. And then he quoted a serial killer that assaulted, murdered, and ate children, and then used the part of the quote about a scat fetish. On January 18th, Chris published a wall of text explaining his body swap with Sonichu, and he doubled down on the merge. Literally right as the U.S. inaugurated Joe Biden on the 20th. February of 2021 was the month where the Sonichu roleplay finally faded after nearly a year. But everything else ramped up. His libido, his loneliness, and the infamous taser plan. On February 4th, the taser plan happened. And what this is, I'm going to read this directly from the Quickie. I'm going to read this explanation of the taser plan directly from the Quickie. And this, I think, will provide a good kind of example of what kind of manipulation Chris himself fell victim to. It's all a clusterfuck of manipulation from every direction. So Chris believed he could harness a taser's power as a means to activate the dimensional merge, wanting to use it to shock his gate crystal and celestial key magic quartz stones, believing the spark could open an interdimensional portal and therefore bring about the merge. This attempt to break the Iron Curtain led to controversy. In February of 2021, Chris wanted to borrow Prater's taser to conduct this experiment on his quartz crystals, which Prater had a supply of tasers as they wished to sell autographed tasers on official Quickie Mart. While Prater initially agreed to meet with him and supervise the experiment so that Chris wouldn't be at risk, the Watchmen White Knight group opposed the plan. They believed that Chris's safety was going to be at risk, to which Chris responded by claiming it would be fine since he himself is part electric. A call between Watchmen, Caden of Prater, and Chris took place, in which Val, a Watchmen member, jokingly told Chris to tase himself on video. Chris volunteered himself, but Caden discouraged Chris, saying it was a bad idea. Watchmen members Knott and MKR Nightv then launched a smear campaign against Prater, creating and spreading rumors by taking out-of-context segments from conversations with Prater and spinning those to create the false impression Prater wished to get Chris to use a stun gun/taser on himself. By omitting that it had been Watchmen member Val who had made the suggestion. This action in turn led to tension between the Watchmen group and Chris, who criticized the group's treatment towards Prater. Ultimately, Prater canceled plans to let Chris borrow their taser to shock his quartz crystals, and the matter remains another of Chris's unresolved attempts to bring about the merge. They also paused plans to sell the autographed tasers in wake of the Watchmen's actions, eventually putting them up for sale in 2022. Two groups trolling the shit out of Chris. One ends up being like, that's a little too far, and tries to stop it and intervene, and then they start fighting each other. And all of this over Chris freaking Chan. The only other big thing to note in February is that at the end of the month, he was starting to talk about his loneliness, that he was spiraling about his lack of a romantic relationship in his life. And he frequently started talking about masturbation on Discord, and especially with women and in various chats. March brought two headlines: the phone calls that were leaked, as well as Chris smashing out the rear window of the caravan. So a lot of other random fights and things happened, but to me, the most important was that on the 20th, he announced his Workaholics Anonymous comic for Brony analysts. Yes, there are grown men on YouTube who analyze and do commentary on My Little Pony. And in Workaholics Anonymous, he bluntly talks about his low sex drive and exhausting masturbation habit. On March 22nd, he began role-playing as a psychic detective preventing a future murder, going kind of into new territory that was outside the normal Sonichu and Rosechu stuff. On the 23rd, a Quickie editor released an interview with a particular user and all of their DMs with Chris. And they were disturbing, to say the least. March 26th marked 10 years since Chris came out as a tomgirl. And I can't go a single episode without throwing out much praise to Gino Samuel, who is a YouTube user who made a comprehensive history of Chris Chan. I think there's like 75 episodes. And these guys, this is the comprehensive history of Chris Chan. If you want to watch YouTube videos, they're like an hour and a half. Some are 2 hours long. And there's 75 episodes. So that's over 100 and probably 50, 60 hours of just Chris Chan video content told in documentary format with all the receipts. But Gino Samuel did this, and he decided to play an April Fool's joke. And he retitled the Comprehensive History series to Donald Trump, A Comprehensive History. And Chris was so incensed by this that he actually DM'd Gino Samuel to complain. On March 28th, he accidentally backed his Dodge Caravan into a big rig trailer. It dented the trunk and then shattered the rear window. In April of 2021, it continued the fallout from that crash, because this is Chris Chan we're talking about. So fans, if you call them, them fans, went to the home, found the car, photographed and posted the damage across social media. And even though Chris kept reiterating that he'd reversed into a trailer, people were thinking that something else happened, or I don't know. It was a big deal. Then his focus wandered to, you guessed it, sex. He messaged a member of Dungeons & Dragons about a, quote, almost sex dream that he had involving the adult version of Chris Thorndike from Sonic the Hedgehog, saying that he felt sex-starved and masturbation was not enough. He also started offering tarot readings to some of his trolls, and he also, by the end of April, was posting about numerology. He was showing a book that he bought. He was rattling off self-analysis. And because we can't go a month without Chris making a bad financial decision, he got another stimulus check and immediately noted that he purchased a 3-month subscription for $165. So to TLDR there, that's December 2020 through April 2021. We have merge prophecies, mod theft and apologies, money spirals, manipulation, tasers, fake psychics, a busted rear window, sex-starved monologues about masturbation and needing to get laid, tarot readings, numerology, and never-ending cycle of merch and medallions and things like that. And we're going to keep going through 2021 because the meltdown arc only accelerates from there. And the last 2 months I'm going to cover quickly, May and June. So May was a weird mix of merch, music, and meltdown posts. On May 4th, Chris shared a, quote, seductive Chris Chan Sonichu image on social media, followed by the usual Mother's Day posts on the 9th, which, starting to get creep with mom vibes here. He was also, his business relationship with Prater was also going strong. He was now selling his own meditation crystals and enchanted rocks. He was also selling spells. He was doing this, but had to drop prices on them because I guess he wasn't getting enough sales. But it is absolutely insane. He made a lot of posts about COVID. He was vaccinated, and he made a new Sonichu medallion. June of 2021, though, is where 2 tracks run in parallel: the public internet stuff and the private, darkest chapter beginning behind the scenes. Publicly, Chris went out into the real world and briefly role-played as his pre-transition self to talk about one of his books. He posted daily tarot card photos, so he was really getting into New Age stuff. He met a couple fans randomly at Barnes & Noble and took photos. There was a lot of activity out in public at this time. He was also starting to go back against his trolls and listed the top 5 people who harmed his life. By the way, that was Idea Guys, Jacob Sockness, Michael Snyder, Blue Spike, and the entire staff of Nathaniel Green Elementary School. Privately, the worst begins. On June 27th of 2021, Chris initiated incest with his mother, Barb. Later accounts indicate a pattern developing by early July. This wouldn't become public knowledge until late July with the infamous recorded incest call and subsequent arrest in early August. But the start date, for all intents and purposes, and from what is known, was June 27th. You also see the ecosystem fracturing. End of June, the Watchmen drama spills out. A lot of his enablers and trolls were infighting. Then the late July leaks just took it home. That's where we're going to stop for this episode. This is already well over an hour, and we're now getting into the shit show. And yes, in the next episode, I'm going to play some segments of the infamous incest call and how that entire situation transpired and went down, and how he was reported to the police and the FBI, and all of this craziness is what we are going to be covering in the next episode. But that is it for today, guys. Next episode is going to be the next Chris Chan episode. Obviously, we are going to bring this home, guys. We probably have in total 3 more episodes left. Well, 2 more episodes left, I'd say, of the Chris Chan series. And then we are done and moving on to other things. Thank you guys for listening. I love all of you dearly. Again, if you're listening, feel free to follow as well. If you like the show, want to stay up to date with the schedule, you can follow at We Saw the Devil Podcast on Instagram, We Saw the Devil on Twitter and Facebook. And again, if you want to follow me and my shenanigans, you can do that at Robin_WSTD. Until then, go try a cherry lime Ricky from Arizona tea. If you are watching Big Brother, go Morgan. And I guess that about covers it. So until next crime, y'all.